Hello everyone, and welcome back to Scary Interesting. In this video, we're going to look at 3 incredibly disturbing pieces of surveillance footage of the last time people were seen alive. One of these is one of the most infamous in true crime history, another is simply as frustrating as it gets, and the final piece precedes one of the worst possible things that can happen to a person. So although the events in this video are fleeting and non-descriptive, they are still highly disturbing, so viewer discretion is strongly advised. On the morning of July 8, 2014, security footage at Varna Airport in Bulgaria captured something so bizarre it would soon become one of the internet's most enduring mysteries. A young German man named Lars, dressed casually in a yellow t-shirt and shorts, suddenly sprinted from the airport's medical office. Without his bags, passport, and even his phone, he sprinted down the terminal and pushed through these sliding doors before slowing to almost a confused jog. Other cameras then picked him up outside, catching Lars climbing over a tall fence, dashing across a field of sunflowers, and then disappearing into the forest beyond. He left everything he owned behind in what seemed like a panic, and that was the last ever confirmed sighting of him. This footage is so strange and chilling that Lars became known as the most famous missing person on YouTube. Before his name was linked to any of this though, Lars lived the kind of life that didn't make headlines. Born on February 9th, 1986 in Berlin, he grew up in a quiet town and never really strayed far from it. Family and friends described him as normal, even average. He was the kind of guy you would never expect to see in the news. He had a steady job at a power plant, a tight-knit circle of friends, and a girlfriend. He kept close ties to his parents, and after his father suffered a stroke, he didn't hesitate to step in and help around the house. His mother Sandra was especially important to him, and the bond between them would be especially important in the days leading up to his disappearance. At nearly 6 feet tall with dark blonde hair and weighing around 187 pounds, Lars looked like a typical young man in good health. The only distinguishing mark he carried was a small scar on his left forearm. Nothing in his life, from work to his relationships to his personality, gave any indication of what was waiting for him in the summer of 2014 in Bulgaria. In late June that year, Lars set out on his first ever trip outside of Germany. He was 28 years old and traveling with 5 friends to Bulgaria's Golden Sands. This is a resort town on the Black Sea coast, often compared to Ibiza. For most of the trip, Lars seemed like himself. Friends remembered him relaxing on the beach, swimming in the pool, playing football, and going out at night. Nothing about his behavior was off, at least not until the very end of the holiday. On July 6th, the night before their scheduled flight home, the group went out drinking at a bar in town. At the bar, Lars got into an argument with other German tourists over football. Lars was a loyal fan of SV Werder Bremen, and the others supported Bayern Munich. It was just sports banter, but it almost escalated to the point of coming to blows. Eventually, Lars parted ways with his friends outside a restaurant and didn't rejoin them for the rest of the night. When his friends returned to their hotel hours later, Lars still wasn't back, and they wouldn't see him again until early morning when he showed up looking shaken. He claimed he'd been attacked by 4 men he believed had been paid by the Bayern fans at the bar. He said they beat him as he made his way back to the hotel, and his jaw hurt, his ear throbbed, and he struggled to hear. The injuries were real too. When Lars went to see a local doctor, he was diagnosed with a ruptured eardrum and a damaged jaw. The doctor then advised him not to fly, warning that the air pressure could worsen his ear injury, and prescribed him an antibiotic called Cefprozil. He also recommended that Lars go to the hospital to be checked out, but Lars refused any further treatment. In response to all of this, his friends offered to stay behind with him until it was safe to fly home, but Lars insisted they leave as planned. So on July 7th, while they boarded their flight home, Lars checked out of the resort and into a hotel closer to the airport, saying he would be fine on his own. This was a decision that in hindsight marked the beginning of his unraveling. Unlike the bustling resort he just left, the Hotel Color that Lars checked into was a small building tucked away in a rougher part of Varna. And that night, for whatever reason, Lars' behavior shifted abruptly and dramatically. He called his mother Sandra several times, and she described his voice as fearful. He first asked her to cancel his credit card, word it had been copied when he checked into the new hotel. He also whispered during parts of their conversations as though someone might be listening. At one point, he even told her there were 4 strange men following him, and in a text message, he described the hotel as strange and said he didn't feel safe in Bulgaria at all. CCTV inside the hotel later showed him pacing nervously through the halls, peering out windows, and even hiding inside the elevator. He looked like someone being hunted, although no one else appeared on camera. At around 1 a.m., he slipped out of the hotel, only to return an hour later, but where he went during that time has never been determined or explained, and by the morning, his paranoia had deepened. On the phone with Sandra again, Lars said that the people chasing him were getting closer. And obviously desperate to get her son home, she booked him a flight for that afternoon and even bought him a backup bus ticket just in case. She then wired him £500 to cover expenses, but he never withdrew the money. Whatever was going on in Lars's mind, it was about to reach a breaking point. He was ready to leave Bulgaria once and for all, or at least he thought he was. On July 8th, so the same day, Lars arrived at the Varna airport via taxi carrying only a backpack and a small travel bag. He texted his mother to let her know he'd made it there safely, and for a moment it looked like the ordeal was over. He was just hours away from flying back to Germany, but before boarding, Lars went to see the airport doctor. His ruptured eardrum still concerned him and he wanted another opinion. The doctor would later describe Lars as nervous and erratic, asking repeated questions about the antibiotics he'd been prescribed. The doctor then reassured him that he was fine to fly, but Lars seemed unconvinced. Then, in the middle of the consultation, a construction worker entered the office. The airport was undergoing renovations at the time, and the man had business there, but to Lars, it was too much. He froze and then began trembling. Suddenly, he leapt to his feet, shouting, "I don't want to die here, I have to get out of here." And with that, he bolted from the office, leaving everything behind. That's when security cameras caught him sprinting through the terminal toward the exit in the now infamous footage. Moments later, Lars disappeared from view of any airport cameras and was never seen again. In the years since he vanished, countless theories have surfaced, each one trying to explain what pushed a healthy 28-year-old man to abandon everything and run into the unknown. One of the more widely discussed explanations has to do with the attack Lars suffered in the days before his disappearance. His ruptured eardrum could have caused severe pain and disorientation, and he could have even had a concussion. Some doctors suggest that he might have suffered brain trauma during the fight, which left him confused and paranoid. Others pointed to the antibiotic cefprozil. While rare, the drug has been linked to serious psychiatric side effects, including hallucinations, paranoia, and even psychosis. But according to his friends and the airport doctor, Lars had been suspicious of the medication and hadn't actually taken it. In fact, he never even had the prescription filled. Another possibility to explain Lars' sudden break from reality was some kind of long-standing mental illness, but his mother insists he had no history of psychiatric problems. However, stress or injury stemming from the fight could have triggered a sudden breakdown though. A few experts believed he experienced an acute psychotic episode that made him believe he was being hunted. On top of those theories, not all theories pointed inward. Some believe Lars' own words and his insistence that he was being followed. Could the men he argued with really have sent someone after him? Or was he caught up in something darker, like a criminal group operating in Bulgaria? Unfortunately, police have never found evidence linking Lars to organized crime, but the potential of foul play lingers. There's also the idea that Lars may have simply wanted to disappear. Some online sleuths theorize that he staged his erratic behavior to throw people off before starting a new life elsewhere. Sandra, meanwhile, rejects this outright, insisting that her son would never vanish voluntarily, not when they were so close to one another. The truth is, nobody knows whether Lars' fears were delusions or if someone really was after him. When Lars sprinted out of the Varna airport and disappeared into the fields, the official trail went cold almost immediately. Bulgarian police launched a search of the area, but there was no sign of him. It was as if he'd evaporated into the summer air. Sandra, meanwhile, refused to accept this as an answer, so she hired a private investigator who combed through hospitals, checked records for unidentified patients, and followed up every lead. The result was unfortunately the same nothing, and every turn was a dead end. Weeks then turned into months, and months into years, with no further developments in the case. Lars' disappearance might have remained just another unsolved missing persons file, if not for the cameras. The footage of him running through the Varna airport has been replayed endlessly, dissected frame by frame by millions of viewers online. By 2018, it had already been watched more than 16 million times, leading to his becoming the most famous missing person on YouTube. The original clip showing him sprinting into the fields has since been deleted from the platform, but by then it was too late. The images had already burned themselves into the internet's collective memory. As of this recording, the case of Lars' disappearance is still unsolved. In the early hours of September 9, 2017, hotel cameras at the Crowne Plaza Chicago O'Hare captured a young woman stumbling along through its hallways. She bumped into walls, swaying with each step, and at times, she looked like she was searching for something she couldn't quite find. At 3:20 a.m., she was seen near the front desk of the hotel, leaning heavily on her surroundings just to stay upright. Moments later, another camera picked her up exiting an elevator on a lower floor. Finally, at 3:32 a.m., the last image of her life was recorded when she pushed through the doors of the hotel's kitchen and disappeared around the corner. Before the headlines and the speculation, and before the footage would loop endlessly online, Kenneka was just an average 19-year-old from Chicago. She lived with her mother, and by all accounts, she was a normal young woman with a wide magnetic smile and a protective streak for the people she loved. Friends described her as fun and loyal, and family members saw her as someone who still leaned on her mom, but was beginning to carve out her own path. On the night of September 8, 2017, she borrowed her mother's car, told her she was heading out to meet up with some friends, and left the house at around 11:30. Her mother, like most parents of teenagers, probably felt that balance between concern and trust, where your kid is old enough to go out, but you still hope they'll be careful. Kenneka was supposed to be with people she knew at a party in a hotel not far from home. The party was in room 926 of the hotel, and by the time Kenneka arrived just after 1 a.m., the place was already packed. About 30 people crammed into the room where music played and drinks flowed. To an outsider, nothing about it would have seemed remarkable, but people who knew Kenneka noticed she wasn't acting like herself. An acquaintance later said she looked unsteady, swaying as she moved, and when she hugged him, it seemed less like a friendly gesture and more like she needed help balancing. Others remembered her sipping cognac, but insisted she didn't take anything stronger. Still, something seemed off. One guest recalled her dancing for a bit before withdrawing and sitting alone, looking sad and almost detached. At 1:30 a.m., she had her last phone call with her sister. It was a quick, ordinary conversation with nothing to suggest that anything was wrong. At some point, her and her friends left the room and were spotted walking through one of the hotel's hallways. Not long after, Kenneka became separated from them. By around 4 a.m., the party was winding down and Kenneka's friends realized she was nowhere to be found. They then called her mother to explain that she was missing using Kenneka's own phone, which she had left behind at the party. For her mother, it was every parent's worst nightmare. The news catapulted her out of bed and she got in her car and drove straight to the hotel, arriving at 5:30 a.m. When she got there, she begged the hotel staff to help her search, and she wanted them to check security cameras. If Kenneka had wandered off somewhere, the hotel was well covered by cameras and the footage would show it, but management told her they couldn't release or even review the recordings unless police were involved. So her mother was left pacing the hotel lobby where her daughter had vanished, knowing the answers might already be on tape. At 7:14 a.m., she finally called the Rosemount police. Instead of springing into action though, they suggested she wait a few more hours, telling her that missing young adults often turn up on their own. And without the police involved, the hotel still refused to look at the cameras. Her mother was instead forced to wait, and with every hour that passed, it seemed like Kenneka was slipping further and further out of reach. By midday, the worry her mother and the partygoers felt had turned into desperation. At 12:46 p.m., Kenneka's older sister filed a formal missing persons report that the police finally accepted. This triggered an official response, and at 1:15 p.m., Rosemount police notified the hotel that Kenneka was considered missing. But even with that designation, it didn't seem to spark the urgency they hoped for. Her family wasn't about to sit idle though. With little to nothing happening since the official missing persons report was filed, they took it upon themselves to start knocking on guest room doors, going floor by floor to ask strangers if they'd seen Kenneka. To them, it felt like the only option left, but a hotel employee eventually called 911 to complain about the disturbance. And so, it wasn't until 10 o'clock on the night of September 9th that police finally reviewed the surveillance footage in earnest, and sure enough, there she was, stumbling through the hallways, exiting the elevators, and wandering into the kitchen. Just after midnight on September 10th, a hotel employee finally found her. At 12:25 a.m., nearly a full day after Kenneka was last seen alive, her body was discovered inside a walk-in freezer in an unused kitchen area of the hotel. She was lying face down on her side and was missing one of her shoes. The freezer's temperature hovered just around 34 degrees Fahrenheit or 1 Celsius, which was cold enough to sap her strength and life in just a few hours. First responders at the scene pronounced her dead at 12:48 a.m. For her mother, who had been pleading for help since sunrise the day before, the news was shattering. All the waiting, searching, and begging to review the surveillance footage ended with the worst possible outcome. After the discovery of her body, ironically, the official investigation moved quickly. On October 6, the medical examiner's office released its finding and ruled that Kenneka's death was a tragic accident. The cause, they said, was hypothermia. Toxicology results showed that Kenneka's blood alcohol level was 0.112, just above the legal driving limit and enough to explain her stumbling movements in the surveillance footage. There was something else in her system too, though. Traces of a prescription medication used to treat epilepsy and migraines. Kenneka had never been prescribed it, though. And when mixed with alcohol, the drug can intensify disorientation, and together they left her unable to recognize the danger she was in or get back out once the freezer door closed behind her. To the medical examiner, Kenneka had wandered into the freezer on her own and simply couldn't survive the cold. And police echoed that position. In their eyes, the case was a tragic accident and nothing more. This official conclusion did little to quiet the storm surrounding Kenneka's death, though. On social media, theories exploded as some insisted she'd been set up by friends whose stories didn't line up. Others believed the hotel itself was hiding something, pointing to the delayed access to surveillance footage as proof of a cover-up. For her mother, though, the outrage wasn't about conspiracies, it was about negligence. She had been at the hotel within hours of her daughter's disappearance, begging staff to check the cameras. She called the police early, only to be told to wait, and when the footage was finally reviewed, it showed exactly what happened to Kenneka. She then filed a lawsuit against the hotel, its security company, and the restaurant leasing the kitchen space where the freezer was located. She argued that all three had failed her daughter: the hotel for not acting sooner, the security team for not intervening, and the restaurant for leaving the freezer powered on and accessible in an unused part of the building. The legal battle stretched on for years, and finally, in 2023, a settlement was reached. Her mother was then awarded roughly $6.4 million. Cortland, Mississippi is the kind of place where everyone seems to know everyone. With a population hovering around 500 people, the gas station on Highway 51 was one of the few local hubs where people cross paths daily. You couldn't walk in for a drink or a snack without bumping into someone who knew your name, your family, and probably what you had for dinner the night before. That's why what happened on the night of December 6, 2014 felt so eerie. Surveillance cameras at the gas station caught a familiar sight: 19-year-old Jessica pulling in to fuel her 2005 Kia Rio. She was a petite girl, not much more than 90 pounds, with a bright personality that people around Cortland knew well. The footage shows her walking toward the store and pausing when someone just off camera caught her attention. Moments later, another camera angle picked up a different figure, a man in a striped shirt filling up a gas can. When he finished, he walked off in the same direction Jessica had gone. The cameras never caught the two together, but the timing would soon be impossible to ignore. Jessica eventually came back into frame, returned to her car, and finished pumping her gas. Afterwards, she climbed back into her Kia and drove away. On the surface, this was totally normal, but less than 90 minutes later, firefighters would find that same car engulfed in flames on a back road not even a mile away. For first responders in Cortland, the call initially sounded routine. A car on fire on a back road was nothing they hadn't dealt with before. They rushed the scene, ready with hoses and gear, expecting to battle a blaze and maybe file a report about a totaled vehicle. What they found, though, was something they never could have prepared for. As they worked to control the flames consuming the vehicle, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a young woman stumbling toward them in nothing but her underwear, with her body covered in horrific burns. Her hair was singed away and her skin was charred, yet she was still moving and somehow clinging to life. The firefighters froze for a moment before realizing she was begging for help. They then scrambled to assist her, radioing for urgent medical evacuation. That woman was Jessica, and the extent of her injuries was almost beyond comprehension. Later reports confirmed that 98% of her body was burned. She was then rushed to a nearby hospital before being airlifted to Memphis, where doctors fought to save her life, but the damage was too severe. Jessica died the next morning, her body failing after the unimaginable trauma she had endured. For those who were there that night, the image of Jessica walking down the road, barely recognizable yet still alive, would never fade. And with her death came the beginning of a mystery that would grip her small town and eventually the nation. Now, understanding the shock of Jessica's murder means understanding who she was and where she came from. Cortland was her entire world, and she was surrounded by family and friends. She lived with her mother right across the street from her grandmother, and just down the road were her father and stepmother. Jessica was even built like Cortland, tiny, yet what she lacked in size she made up for in spirit. She was apparently outgoing, athletic, and had a stubborn streak that made her both endearing and a handful. As a kid, she played softball and cheered at South Panola High School, and like a lot of teenagers, she had a rebellious streak. She sometimes dabbled in risky circles, getting involved with drugs and running with people tied to gangs. And in Panola County, where violent crime sometimes reached into even the smallest corners, it wasn't unusual for young people to brush up against trouble. Still, those who knew her remember Jessica for her warmth and ambition, and that's exactly what made her violent passing so hard to reconcile. Investigators have been able to piece together parts of Jessica's final evening, but much of it still remains a frustrating blank. The surveillance footage from the gas station provided a window into her movements, but after that, the trail grows hazy. What happened in those missing moments, including who she saw, what was said, and how the night spiraled, has never been fully understood. Sometime after a call with her mother around 7 p.m., Jessica's car ended up on a remote stretch of road just a short distance from the gas station. Firefighters who responded to the blaze later testified that when they arrived, Jessica was walking toward them, her body engulfed in burns and staggering, but still alive. In those next few moments, she reportedly said a name over and over again, trying to tell rescuers who had done this to her. That name was Eric or maybe Derek, depending on which of the first responders was asked. An autopsy would also later confirm the horror of what happened to Jessica. Nearly her entire body had been burned, the only untouched skin being the soles of her feet. Early reports even suggested that an accelerant had been poured down her throat, though that detail was later walked back as untrue. But regardless, the brutality was undeniable. Whoever had done this wanted Jessica destroyed. So from the very beginning, Jessica's case was treated as more than just a small-town crime. It was a case that demanded answers, and investigators tracked down nearly anyone who might have spoken to Jessica that night, knocking on doors, combing through alibis, and pulling together phone records. In total, they poured over more than 1,000 phone numbers and interviewed at least 150 people. One possibility was that Jessica's boyfriend, who was in prison at the time, had somehow orchestrated it, but that lead didn't pan out. Others suspected gang involvement, given Jessica's occasional connections to people in that world. But local gang members not only denied it, they publicly offered condolences to her family, something investigators found unusual if they were truly involved. Even the man in the striped shirt who was seen filling up a gas can while Jessica was there was identified and cleared of any involvement. So the most important clue remained Jessica's own words in the moments before she died. Who was Eric or Derek? The problem was, Cortland wasn't exactly short on Eric's or Derek's. But investigators then chased down each one, questioning men who fit the name, and came up empty. For more than a year, investigators chased down leads that went nowhere. Then in February 2016, they announced a breakthrough in the arrest of a 27-year-old named Quentin. Police then quickly moved to charge him with capital murder in Jessica's death because Quentin was no stranger to Jessica. The two knew each other, and by most accounts they were friends. He also wasn't a stranger to law enforcement. In Panola County, he already had 3 prior convictions, 2 for burglary and 1 for fleeing police. He had also been released from prison just 2 months before Jessica was killed. What drew suspicion was Quentin's behavior after Jessica's death. Investigators discovered that he had deleted all of his text messages and call history with Jessica. When pressed, he claimed that he didn't want a dead person's information sitting on his phone. This was an explanation that only fueled investigators' suspicions. The arrest came after an exhaustive probe that stretched far beyond Mississippi. Investigators tracked down phone records and followed leads as far as Iowa and Tennessee, and ultimately, the circumstantial evidence was enough to bring charges in the case, but Quentin's story didn't end there. Authorities in Louisiana later identified him as the prime suspect in another killing, the 2015 torture and stabbing of a 34-year-old international graduate student. The brutality of that case, in which she was allegedly tortured for her debit card PIN, only deepened suspicions about him. But despite all of this, Quentin's involvement in Jessica's case wouldn't be simple to prove. Charging him was one thing, but convicting him would turn out to be another. When Quentin was brought to trial, many thought the case against him would finally bring closure to Jessica's family. But the courtroom battles that followed only underscored how fragile the evidence against him really was. The first trial in 2017 ended in a mistrial. Jurors deliberated for hours, at one point even announcing they had reached a verdict, but when polled individually, they couldn't agree. A second trial in 2018 played out much the same way. Prosecutors leaned heavily on cell phone data, suggesting Quentin's phone placed him near Jessica that night she was attacked. They also pointed to his deleted messages and inconsistent statements, but without physical evidence tying him directly to the crime, the defense was able to hammer away at the gaps. The biggest among them were Jessica's final words. First responders swore under oath that she had said Eric or Derek, and Quentin was neither. When the second jury came back deadlocked, another mistrial was declared. Prosecutors then ultimately decided not to pursue a third attempt at convicting Quentin. For all the time, money, and effort spent, the state simply couldn't close the case. So nearly a decade after her murder, Jessica's death still hangs over Cortland and Mississippi as one of the region's most baffling unsolved cases. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. If you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it to the forum found in the description. Also, if you want to support the channel, consider joining the Patreon or becoming a channel member here on YouTube. Anyways, thanks again, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.